This is Diana Sullivan in Austin, Texas. This is a little toy knitting machine. It's definitely vintage and maybe it qualifies as antique. It has the label Sister on it, and I did a video with it a few years ago. We were talking about this machine, and we think, based on what other people have told me, that perhaps a sponge bar could be installed or replaced in it, and then the needles wouldn't be so loose and flippy. So John is about to try that.
I think that in order to have a sponge bar, the logical place would be underneath this rail closest to the hooks in the needles. So I'm going to remove this rail by undoing the nuts to get to that are holding these screws in place, which hold this rail on, and we'll see if we can install a sponge bar there. The tool I'm using is a 5.5 millimeter socket. An alternate size in US is a 7/32 of an inch, both of which are a little bit odd sizes. Since this was presumably made in Japan, it's likely to be metric, but 5.5 millimeter is kind of small and an in-between size, but that's what fits the nuts best.
Does it say made in Japan on it somewhere?
Well, I don't know that it does. You have the box. I would look on the box and see if it says anything.
Okay, I'll do that.
But I don't know, I don't see anything about where it was made.
Why don't you go ahead and start?
Okay, so I'm going to unscrew.
So John, you're taking out the nuts right now?
Yes.
Ah, okay.
Well, I'm loosening them, then I'll flip it over because they have some little bit of, looks like clear paint on them, which is a technique to keep them from unscrewed, kind of an early Loctite. And unfortunately, because of that, when you try to unscrew them, once the nuts get loose, they won't unscrew from the screw without holding the screw from the other side. So I'm loosening them all, and then I'll flip it over and put a screwdriver in the other side to hold them from turning.
Oh, okay.
So here we go.
Oh, if you don't stick the screwdriver in, then it'll just spin in its hole.
Right. So you need something to keep the screw from turning. And just putting your finger on it, you can't quite hold it tight enough. So there's one undone, the screw falls out, so be sure you catch it. And there's a screw, a nut, and a washer. And I'm dropping them in a little egg carton just to keep them all together. And so the next screw.
Well, one of the things I saw on the comments to the old video is that one of the knitters took hers apart. She said it was fiddly, but that it worked better after she took it apart and added some sponge or felt. So I'll stop filming and I'll start again when you are ready to take the bar off.
Right.
John and I have not been able to figure out the exact age of this machine. And we think that to change the needles in it, you have to have this bar off. However, we don't even know if it came with any spare needles. Fortunately, none of my needles are missing or damaged. Ready?
We're removing the bar. We don't see any place for a
sponge bar.
Sponge bar underneath. There was no sponge bar, but it would sure help.
Well, one lady said she used a piece of foam that she cut down something from an LK150 sponge, and I've got some weather strip. Another lady said she used a piece of yarn. What do you think?
Well, there isn't much room for something to be there. I mean, it wasn't made with room for something, so whatever you use will have to be extremely thin.
So John's lifting off this bar because if he takes out a needle, he sees something we weren't exactly expecting. There's really not room to put a sponge over the needle, but if he takes out a needle and we use a flashlight, we can see something dark in there. And it's not going to show on camera, but the thinking now is that maybe we can put some sort of padding in this area. It would run the whole distance across, and it would be sandwiched between this red and some metal on the back. So
Right.
this means that John gets to take all of these screws out next.
Right. And this is in this thing that looks like an old sponge bar is in line with the C on the bed, which is the, there's an ABC depth. There's A, there's B needle position, C needle position. It's right underneath the C needle position across the bed. And if I look at a needle, I can see a little spot of corroded looking or grubby looking that corresponds with that location, which is the same pattern you see on other knitting machines that use a sponge bar if the sponge bar has sat in that spot for a long time and gotten old.
John,
So I
do
think
you
the next step is to remove the second rail and lift out the red bed so that we can access and or replace whatever little sponge bar was in there.
is the stuff on the needle gooey, like melted rubbery stuff?
Uh,
Or do you think it could be just corrosions from maybe damp being held by some felt?
It could be corrosion, and I would have to probably get a razor blade and see if scraping it off, if it just scrapes right off, or if it's actually corroded metal. In which case a little teeny bit of very fine sandpaper might be in order to get any corrosion off. Because, if you put in a new sponge bar and the needle has a little bad spot, it'll kind of tear into the needle a little bit. So these may need a little cleanup work as well, because you can't get new needles for this, I don't think.
Do they have to all come out no matter what we decide to do?
It looks like, well, as soon as you turn it over and mess with it, you're probably going to spill them all, so you might as well take them all out, because that's going to happen. They're going to come out. I'm pretty sure. And besides, we'll probably want to flip it over to get to the plate on the back.
Sure.
Well, if I flip it over, everything falls out, but there's a metal plate on the back. Where's this? Put the bar in for a second. Turn it over so we can look at the metal bars. This whole metal piece has to come out, and I think there's a little sponge bar underneath that right along here, resting probably on the metal and poking up against the needles from the bottom.
So our next step is to have a look at what's really in there, and maybe we'll have a clue what it was made of.
Right, which means we have to start by undoing the 8 nuts and screws that are across the other end of the bed from the bottom.
John thinks the dark patch on each needle is rust, so I've taken the needles out for soaking. So John, this is what it's like all apart?
Yes, and as you can see, using my screwdriver for a pointer, you can see a little bit of what used to be sponge bar still stuck to the plastic at this end and this end, but the bulk of it is stuck right here across the back of this metal plate, and this was on the underside of the bed and held the bed together. And so we're going to have to make ourselves a little piece of sponge bar out of something and stick it back in here.
We'll come back when we figure something out. In the meantime, I have all the needles soaking in a rust remover, and I found an ancient Brillo pad to give them a gentle scrub because they've got a tiny bit of rust right where they touch the foam rubber.
I have put in place what will be our replacement sponge bar, and what it's comprised of is some foam insulation that we happen to have. This is pretty thin foam insulation that I very carefully cut down to be very narrow in width. You can just cut it with the scissors. and then I stuck it down on the metal backing plate that I had removed earlier and cleaned all the old residue off. And then I used some adhesive, some cloth adhesive tape to put down on front of it. Now this is wider, and the idea is for this to spread out, because when I put this in, it's going to get pressed into this groove in the needle bed, and that will, the needles will rub across this white stuff, because if it just rubs on this foam, I find the foam to be too sticky to the needles without something else to ride on. So that's what I'm going to do. So then I'm going to flip this over and put it in place, and then I'll screw it down. So that's what we have here, and it sets down in the needle bed like this, and we'll get that little thing to line up in the groove, and the end plates will go on, and the screw holes will line up, and we will flip it over, put one of the metal rails in, put all the needles back in, then put in the second rail. So that's what we're going to do next.
In the meantime, the needles are soaking in some lamp oil, and I'm about to drain that off, and I will wipe them down with some knitting machine oil, and they'll be ready to put in once John has some of these screws reinstalled.
Right. We'll flip it over, just make sure that the channel is, we can see the white. You can't really see it, but if you look when you do it yourself, you can see this little teeny bit of strip of white underneath the bed, right in line with the C level, needle level on the plastic end caps. So that's what we're going to do. That's our next step, is to start putting the rails in. And so here we go.
We'll be back when the rail, at least one rail, is on.
Right.
Well, John has put all the needles back in, and he's starting the screws to cover the needles with that other metal bar. So pretty soon here, this machine will be all reassembled. I want to try out this newly rehabbed sister toy machine. It's a beautifully built old knitting machine that was sold as a toy in the 1960s, and now it has a new sponge bar, and it has clean oil needles. I am tying a piece of ravel cord to my right hand clamp, running the cord through this slot, then through the take-up spring opening, then under this wheel right here and through this slot. And I'm going to pull out a group of needles, every other needle, using the needle pusher that came with it. And I'm going to make sure my latches are open. This is the little cast-on that was in the manual that came with the machine. And then I knit slowly from one side to the other, unthread the ravel cord. So my ravel cord is hanging down on the left. I'm untying it from the clamp on the right, and it's hanging down both directions. The manual shows you hanging a tool from this, but I have a clothespin handy, so I'm going to use a clothespin to put a little bit of weight on this. I have some Group 1 fine acrylic yarn. I found that this machine will take fine yarn or Group 2 yarn on every other needle. Fine will go on every needle. I didn't have much luck with using anything thicker, and it doesn't really seem to like cotton yarn. It likes acrylic and wool. It works very, very well with hand knitting sock yarn. I'm tying this yarn around this clamp, threading this side the same way through the slot, take up spring, tension wheel, over the peg and through that little slot. And then I have to remember to put out the in-between needles. So there they are, and across I go. And it knits with my green fine yarn. Now this didn't come with weights, but if you want to add a little weight to it, you can pull down on the string However, it knits very well without weights. And look how smooth and easy this is now that we've done a little work to it. This machine had a problem with its tension spring. This spring is a little bit worn, and yet it doesn't seem to be an issue now that we have a good sponge bar in it. And look, it just knits like so. The machine has only 49 needles, but there's a lot you can do with 49 needles. And this is just effortless. So there's my piece from really just a few seconds of knitting. And what's that, a little knot in my yarn? A little unevenness right there, probably from the yarn. The stitches look absolutely great from the other side. So I am just so very happy that this machine is rehabbed and running so very beautifully. In fact, I'm sure that I'll have to do some experimenting with this machine. It has 49 needles. There's quite a lot of things you can make, though, with 49 needles. So that is my sister vintage knitting machine after a little bit of rehab work. You can help me out, and you can get YouTube to suggest more machine knitting videos to people. Just click on the subscribe, the notify, and the like, because YouTube is all about the numbers. If you want more information about machine knitting, for instance, free patterns over at my blog, or to see my other YouTube videos, or to join my Facebook group, that information is all in the description box below the video.